the audience out there, I have a great guest with us today, and I'm going to do like I always do and let you give us a little bit of your background, who you are, what you do, and the audience that you serve, because I think you obviously know yourself and your background a lot better than I do. So, Laurence, if you would just introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, no, appreciate it, John. Thanks for having me on. So I'm Laurence Whittam from QX Global Group and a subdivision called QX Accounting Services. And I've been in the industry for now just over a decade. And I work directly with CPA firms, over 500 firms over the past 10 years, and also accounting firms, bookkeeping firms, and any real financial professionals. And we provide sort of two areas. The first major area is around outsourcing. So we physically have a team of 2,500 accountants across the world, predominantly in India, and we support CPA firms and accounting firms in the US. And the second part of it, what has developed over the years, is actually working more hands-on with those CPA firms to help them both expand on the staffing side, but also actually help their own practices, whether it's adding new services, whether it's clearly communicating certain areas that they do have as a service, but they're not currently promoting. And again, I work quite hands-on the practice management side with these firms as well.
Okay. So one of the things that I talk a lot about when we talk about communication is context. So for folks that don't know you very well, we have an idea now of what you do professionally, what your firm does. Take me back a little bit. Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in England. So again, I've got a mixture of accents now because I moved here to the US. I'm in New Jersey now. I moved here about 14 years ago. So I did a couple of years of high school over here, moved over for my dad's job at the time. And he was a CFO for a large cybersecurity that expanded from the UK to the US. And did my college over here as well in New Jersey. And then actually got brought out by a family friend and an owner of the business, QX Global Group, who lives in the UK at that point in time, and moved over to India for 3 months to sort of get more of an internship and work in different areas that actually in the business, with not the expectation of then coming across to expand their business to the US. But again, in a positive way, it sort of spun into that very quickly. I think it was the owner's thought to do that from the beginning, but again, not in my mind. It was more of an internship.
What did you study in college? What was your degree?
So I was business management. So again, I've always had some of the accounting side of it in there, but really I enjoy the strategic side of things. I enjoy the planning and just overall business knowledge, whether it's sales, marketing, the full spectrum. And this gave me an opportunity to actually explore the different divisions inside a business as well. So I wasn't just going over for one specific area. It was really learning the business as a whole, which was, again, very appealing at the time.
So I've done a lot of work with, as I'm sure you see all the time, we're increasingly working in environments where we're working with people from all different backgrounds, right? Different countries, different cultures. What are some of the things that stood out to you when you were in India, maybe culturally, that from a communication standpoint were things that you kind of had to learn and adapt to?
Yeah, so there's I would say one of the somewhat weaknesses within India is partly that communication. And I know that based on other areas that you can outsource to. So I've always sort of known that as an area. So we've always tried to make sure that the right person is in touch with a firm and who can communicate properly and actually understand what is being said, because a lot of the times the culture is known for saying yes, and they'll just, yes, I can do this. Yes, I can do this, without really having necessarily the knowledge to do so or fully understanding the scope of the project, for example. So that was a big sort of immediate sort of shift that we had to make in the industry, to say, no, it's okay to say no at times as well, right? You don't have to know everything. You don't have to accept every bit of business. Let's figure out the best way that's going to set the right expectations so it's a successful relationship.
That's a great point on awareness, to be aware of those things. So are there any tips that you could offer to folks that that maybe you learned the hard way from experience, where you can kind of get a feel for those cultural things that you need to maybe adapt to and be proactive, as opposed to waiting for them to pop up in a negative way when people are dealing with people from other cultures?
Yeah, so and I think it comes with two sides there, right? There's other cultures, and there's also just working virtually as a whole. And I think the accounting industry, typically from what I've seen over the past decade, is it's very slow to act. They're not the first movers. They're not the ones to jump into it. The tech industry, for example, it's much more adept to using people virtually and around the world, right? So I think that was definitely and I'm very much a go-getter in terms of I love a solid plan, but unless you put something into action, it's never going to happen. So whereas it's sort of the reverse role with a CPA firm, you've got to slow down a little bit. They have to really understand everything before they go. So it was that portion of it, that culture, especially in India, very family driven, very educational driven. So what they don't have is as much experience necessarily. By the time we come out of college, we start working. We do internships throughout college. Over there, it's a little bit different, and they will really focus 100% of their time on their educational side of things. They want to be the best of the best. It's very competitive over there, which is great because it has exceptional talent, but then they don't have the real world experience as much. So you're starting a few years later in life for them. And then, like I said, and then as you graduate again, over here, we have our families, but it's a different side of it over there. Like, again, even just from a base of weddings, right? The weddings are enormous, right? I mean, 300, 400, 500 people to them. So you have friends, you have families, like you go to a number of them a year, right? So it's a bit more of a common thing, and it's a 5-day event. It's not a 1-day event like ours. So it means that, again, that you have to allow them to do that because that's part of the culture, right? And they're living with family, typically their parents, right? So they're living with their parents, or one set of parents at least, when they get married. So again, it's now we're working in a virtual world. Again, you have to understand they're not in houses typically over there as well. They're more so in apartments. So it's a smaller space. So you're going to have sort of people passing by in the background and things like that. They have to try and keep it in a professional setting, obviously, but it's just a different world in that sense as to how they're living.
What's interesting, as you're describing that sounds more and more how most people kind of ended up being when the pandemic started, where we were forced to be at home. And then we kind of had to start learning how to deal with those things like, well, gosh, it's not just you at home. It might be your spouse and your kids, and they might be in a meeting virtually. You might be in a meeting virtually. And then the kids are maybe trying to do some classwork and you're all online. And so it creates all of these challenges that we've now at least somewhat adapted to, because we've had a couple of years now. But that kind of leads me to a question. In what you do, what are some of the problems? Because I always think about, when I think about business, I think about the crux of any business is what are the problems that we solve for the people that we serve. So when you think about like the most common problems that your business solves for your customers, what are some of the ones that are top of mind for you?
So I would say it depends on the size of the firm typically that we're working with, right, as to how organized they are. But the number one by far is talent, right, and talent availability. Right now, especially post-COVID, there's a huge talent crunch in the accounting and finance space. There's just not enough people, not just in the US, but around the world, to really service what we're doing. And there's a lot more competitiveness in the public accounting realm because private companies are coming in. There's a lot more popping up, and they all want their CFO, they all want their director of finance, offering very, very attractive salaries. And even from the lower end accounts payable, accounts receivable type positions, again, it's they're paying more competitively than a public firm, for example. So there's a very big crunch. It's not portrayed as a sexy industry either, which has not helped with the number of enrollments in college graduates and everything like that. And it definitely can be, right? as you move up and move towards more of like a planning side of it, a strategic aspect of it. But it's typically those people in the industry are somewhat more introverted as a whole. So it makes it a bit more difficult to break out of that shell and really get to that stage of it. So just providing talent is definitely number one, right? And that compliance aspect. And then I would say number two is, again, for the smaller firms, is really creating more of a process in the firm. Typically, they do what they do. They use the software as much as they know the software, but they don't create and document standard operating procedures and treat it like a business. A lot of firms have really hired accountants, not hired people from outside of the industry, like a technology person, somebody on the IT side to really like help with automation or anything like that. Even now you see this just starting to get HR professionals in rather than having their most personable accountant in the office do the HR. And that's really in the past few years that we've seen that development. So it's definitely transitioning, and I think COVID has shook a lot of things up in the industry, but they're probably the two biggest core items we are helping firms on a day-to-day.
So you said something that I found interesting and very, very true in my personal experience, which was when I was in school and I was an accounting major. Choosing the accounting major had nothing to do with it being sexy or cool. I literally chose that major because I just thought at some point I want to have my own business. So I want to learn about business. And then I perceived that accounting for me was the hardest degree. So I thought if I can master the hardest one, then I'll be in good shape, right? Yeah. But what I realized as I was getting closer to graduation is I started trying to figure out the different types of opportunities that were available in accounting. And to your point about it not being portrayed as sexy or cool, maybe let's talk about some of the stuff that, in my opinion, actually is pretty sexy or cool work, like management consulting, FP&A work, the type of work that maybe starting in accounting, like I started in public accounting, for example, and I did what a lot of people tend to do, which is I stayed in public accounting for a couple of years, and that kind of set me up because I worked at a large CPA firm. It set me up to be able to kind of jump in at a higher level, like a manager level, than I would have if I would have started out in private accounting, working for a company for a couple of years. So what are some of the types of roles that you see accountants being able to move into that might be a little bit more appealing in terms of the type of work that they're doing?
Yeah, and I would say, again, a couple of the areas you mentioned, like the management accounting and areas like that, but it's really moving the industry towards the advisory role, right? And if you hear any type of sessions in the industry, any advisors, any influencers, they're all talking about the same thing in terms of stop doing the compliance and focusing on that. Start focusing on moving up the ladder in terms of advisory services, because it's not just that it's generally a comfort thing where they don't move towards that and they give away that type of advice for free in a lot of cases in those conversations and one-off meetings that they're having with their clients. But the actual businesses that they're working with are in need of it, and also they respect and really will take that to the highest level, right, as well, because they see the CPA, the attorney, as really their advisors to their business. So the more involved you can get, the better it is. I mean, to me as well, it's more fun, right? It's you're not just thinking about one aspect. You're now thinking about even the marketing, the sales, like types of budgets. How are they forecasted? What does it look like if the business is going to grow in this direction? What's the next step for the business? Are they going to go IPO? Are they going to raise some capital? Right? There's all these areas now where you can become so much more valuable to a business as well. And again, being valuable is, again, in my eyes, is one of those just personal areas where you're going to feel appreciated for what you do, right? Yeah. More so than necessarily sorting out a set of books and passing it along, because that's what has to be done on a monthly basis.
Yeah. So you mentioned something, you mentioned that you see them a lot of times giving away advice. Do you think they're doing that as like a way to establish their worth and their value to then get a different type of business, maybe audit business or tax business or something like that? Is that why you see them giving it away sometimes?
I think it's an involuntary thing, I think it's just something they're doing accidentally in terms of they're sitting down. Typically, they're having to give back a piece of work, whether it's an audit, whether it's a set of books, whether it's the tax season going on. So obviously, a corporate tax return, going and sitting down with the client. And now they're doing some tax planning and strategy at that one point in time. But they're not being able to implement much over the year, for example. So they're not selling them a package where they can go and look at a set of accounts every single month to now actually give the most impact to a client. So they're giving valuable advice on a one-off, but it's now following up and making sure they're doing it, and now checking on it again the following year and throughout the year is a better way to make sure that those actions that, again, even you're providing to them, they're being done and it's showing results at the end of the day.
Yeah, so that kind of makes me think about mindset, right? That it sounds like sometimes they're just not in that mindset to be thinking about some of those different areas. Like you mentioned the word reflexive, right? They're almost accidentally or reflexively giving advice that could be an actual whole additional piece of business that they're getting, but they're not going into it with the right mindset. What are some of the things that you see when you're working? So I kind of look at it as kind of two different sides of the equation, right? So just kind of talking about what you were saying about the helping with talent sourcing, right? So I think about it from the standpoint of the candidate looking for a role, and then, the company looking for the candidate. Where do you see where there are some of those sort of where they're not connecting the dots between what the candidates are focusing on in terms of putting their best foot forward and what the organizations might be looking for in those candidates?
Yeah, so I think that comes into somewhat one of the challenges as well, right? And it's one of the cultural challenges over in India specifically, and I'm sure other locations too, is they don't necessarily show their development in business by the salary, right? They're not going to go around and talk to their family and neighbors and friends about the salary they're getting. But what they do have, there are very little secrets in India. And what they do know is how many people you're managing, for example. So they want to build a team very quickly, and they've sort of been driven on the culture of, you don't need to be the best accountant. You don't need to be the best tax person that knows and every single piece of it and the expert. What is going to drive your really independent growth in a business is how many people you can manage, right? And at the end of the day, a business is somewhat that as well, is delivering value, but being able to scale it, right? So it's a good thing, but it's typically firms over here are now looking for more of that compliance piece to be filled, right? So that they can actually deliver more and train more internally to go up the ladder and upscale some of the services they're delivering, which means that unless they're doing it at scale, where now they can keep growing an individual, they're going to lose team members every year rather than keeping them, because they're not seeing a team built around them. And we're trying to sort of balance it a little bit in terms of we're actually going to pay you more if you're an expert in your field, right? Don't worry about managing 100 people. I can hire somebody that's not an accountant to manage typically better than a lot of accountants would, right? In terms of people, because then it's more people related rather than accounting. And focus on your craft, right? Focus on this area to keep improving. And again, that will move you up the ladder. So we're trying to balance it a little bit. And but that is definitely a challenge culturally, especially over in India.
That's an interesting perspective, because I think what I've preached to a lot of my clients is a little bit contrarian to that, which is that if you look at when you're moving up in your career, when you first start out, you're a technician and you're a doer, right? So typically your job would be, your boss would give you a set of tasks to do. You're not managing anyone else. You're just doing your tasks, right? And then as you progress, maybe you get promoted to a supervisor, and now maybe you've got one or two or a few other people. And the majority of what you're responsible for is still getting your own tasks done, but you're also managing a few other people. And then as you move up, there's less of you doing tasks of your own and more of you managing and leading other people and getting their tasks done. And so I've always kind of taken the approach that if you can have both of those skill sets, that makes you that much more valuable, right? So if you, for example, brought in that person that had tremendous leadership skills, but was not a technical accountant, that's still very valuable. But if you had that same person that also had that accounting or the finance skill set in addition to that, man, that's where you see people getting bumped up to CFOs and CEOs and those C-suite types of positions. And it's interesting you mentioned that in the culture in India, that it's more about like the number of people that you manage than your salary. I haven't worn it in years, but I used to wear a t-shirt underneath my dress shirt when I would do seminars. And when we got to the part where we were talking about communication and culture, I would unbutton my dress shirt and open it up, and people would see the t-shirt and it said, "My budget is bigger than yours." And the whole idea was trying to communicate to people is sometimes we get so wrapped up in how we look at measures of worth or importance. Yep. And there's even a tendency, and tell me if you've seen this, that especially in finance and accounting, when we're looking at someone's resume or their LinkedIn profile, we're being taught to talk in terms of how many people did we lead, how big was the budget we managed, what are measurable metrics that we can tell somebody we moved an organization from X to Y, whether it's profitability, efficiency, or whatever those things are. Right. So it's interesting. You talked before we started recording, you mentioned leadership. How does that factor into when you're working with companies trying to help them source talent? How do you, in that process, ferret out, first of all, like what types of leadership qualities that company might be looking for? And then what are some of the questions that you're asking on the talent end, on the sourcing end, to figure out if those people have those skills to be able to match those up?
Yeah, so, and one of the big, we call it selecting a champion in the firm, right? So, and again, this is a new operation typically for a lot of firms. It's completely new. They need somebody to lead it, and they need somebody to take ownership for outsourcing or working with any remote team, right? Whether they're onshore, offshore, wherever. And it creates some control and stability because they know your company, right? And they know how you want it back, but they also need to select the right person, right? So, and this is part of the, and again, somewhat understanding and education we try and give is that typically the person they'll first choose is the person that needs the staff. The reason they need the staff is typically because they keep losing staff themselves, right? Either they're not delegating the work themselves very well, they're not training and retaining their staff because they want to stay there, or they're not necessarily the best manager themselves, right? So having that person be the lead on it is it's not the right way to go, right? From the start, right? You really need somebody that is willing to train, willing to understand that it's not just a one-off. Yes, you're going to come up with a perfect example immediately, like for the type of work. It's that you need to give feedback. We don't just take it off the plate and go and finish it ourselves. If you want it done better, you have to give it back. Give back the notes. Expect timelines to be stretched slightly initially with these projects, and really work with the teams hands-on. So we really try and help them select that person both internally in their firm as well. And sometimes it is somewhat of an awkward conversation because, again, they're a client of ours, but it's saying, guys, you've selected the wrong person on your side. It's not the people on our side necessarily. We're getting no feedback. We're not getting any type of interaction whatsoever, right? We need that. You need that in order to make it work, especially when, not just from a cultural perspective, working with an outsourcing firm, but really working with anyone virtually, because you have less communication, less of a relationship built up immediately, because you're not there, you don't have the office talk going on, and you can't sit and go and have lunch with somebody. So it's ever more important to make sure that that person is selected and they're the correct person, right? And vice versa, right? In terms of the communication, it needs to be somebody on the outsourcing firm or whoever they're working with to understand what is being asked of them, set the right expectations, and really understand the level of the person they're looking for as well, right? So because there's a vast difference between a senior accountant in the US to a senior accountant in India, right? And they have the same amount of years of experience. They could have been working on the same things, but it comes a lot more naturally because of them being in-house, them working, them learning from somebody real time in the US. and you'll find there's typically a 2-year, 3-year gap in terms of educational difference when it comes to the physical work of somebody over here and the speed that they can do it in, at least for the first year. And it's quite a sizable gap.
It's interesting. So I heard you say something that seems to come up a lot in communication issues in general, which is expectations, right? Many times when we have communication challenges or any kind of challenge in any relationship, more times than not, it's not the actual outcome that people get upset about. It's that the outcome didn't match their expectations, right? So I'll sometimes use a simple example that everybody can relate to. If you and I go out to eat together and I order steak and I get chicken, I'm not happy, right? I like chicken also, but that's not what I ordered. That wasn't my expectation. And so that violation of the expectations is where we go awry. And so I think a lot of times, and you touched on this in what you just said, is getting everyone kind of on the same page with those expectations. This is what we want and need in this role. These are the types of things that you're going to be dealing with, and communicating clearly all along the way. And another thing that you said, it sounds like your experience sort of validates some of the raw statistics I've looked at, which all seem to point to that people typically are not leaving jobs because of the organization. It's typically because of the person that they're reporting to, or the people, the leadership in that company more times than not are the reasons that people leave. Is that pretty consistent with what you see?
Yeah, I would say I would say that's probably one of the more common factors, right? I mean, typically a lot, and again, not every business, but a lot of businesses, especially in this industry, are growing, right? They've got more business than they know what to do with, to be honest. So it's not the growth side of it. A lot of owners and partners are now opening the books and sort of giving in to the talent to some extent to say, okay, you're asking for this, I'll give you this, right? If this is what you want, this is less of a headache for me to actually give you that, right? And keep you with us, because we've invested a lot of time and energy into you. And again, but it's the relationship at the end of the day. They still need a good relationship with whoever you're working with, right? It needs to be, you and your manager need to click at the end of the day. If there's conflicts that go on regularly and you're just not fitting, it causes like a disruption, right? In just the workflow, in terms of how you're working. And it's not necessarily that anybody's bad. It's just that they're not necessarily in the right nest. They need to be moved across. Right. Yep. So it's finding the right leader that you appreciate, that is giving the right responsibilities to you as well. And we sort of see the same thing over in India. And it's just, and again, it's expectation setting in terms of, don't jump into, we don't want to give you 5 people to manage, 10 people to manage immediately. We want you to get there, but take more time to do it, right? Learn what you need to learn, appreciate that role that you're doing currently, so that then when you are passing it on to somebody else, you'll appreciate the work that they're doing as well, right? So it's really taking it gradual steps up the ladder, rather than jumping the gun and going on a separate approach and just treating it like anybody can be a manager. Because it's a difficult, dealing with people, you've got to understand everybody's different, and you can't, it's not a one size fits all approach, and especially not now, because it's become a lot more challenging for talent. So you've got to really have both the structure. There has to be some type of system internally, but everybody's situation at home is different, right? And they're dealing with those situations at home a lot more now because they're there all the time, right? So I think there's been a lot of challenges, not just in this industry, in every industry, and we've seen a lot of movement of talent everywhere, really. But the accounting firms are getting, definitely there's a lot of movement going on right now. So
it sounds like accounting, more so than other industries, is still, if I were to use a real estate analogy, much more of a seller's market, right? Where Correct. The talent really, I don't want to say they're in the driver's seat, but they've got a little bit more ability to sort of determine their own outcomes more so in past years. And I've tried to keep people focused, especially when I talk about like communication skills, on getting a mindset that they still need to keep in mind that they need to be delivering value and thinking of ways that they can deliver more and more value to sort of set themselves up for success in the long term. Because if we get lulled into this sense of security that, hey, I'm in demand right now, right? And we see this in the media, right? Where we've got people that are, they're making demands on work conditions, on salaries and different things like that. Well, at some point, this is going to turn, right? And at some point, then the employers will be much more in the driver's seat. And if you set yourself up from all the way back when you hypothetically were more in the driver's seat as a team player, as someone who's always going above and beyond and always over delivering and being focused on delivering value, now that kind of sets you up where you're not being scrutinized now. If now the demand outstrips the supply, and you've really kind of put yourself in a whole separate category. So
correct.
I'm
We
curious.
see it. I was going to say, we see a huge amount in India, right? In terms of now just talent, and like, again, a huge amount of talent, less of a crunch than over here in the US. However, they have open opportunities on the table, but now firms, again, in previous years, they would look at how many years with the last 2-3 companies that you were with, right? Making sure there was some, not just a quick mover, for example.
Right.
It probably went out the window for the past 2 years because everybody was moving. There was a lot more shakeup. There was a lot of demand. And like you're saying, though, it's not taking those types of things for granted to some extent as well from an accountant's perspective, because again, we still see occasionally, it's becoming less often, but again, the raises over there, they went a bit crazy and they're like 40% raises, but they'll jump from one to the next very quickly. But what's biting them in the butt a little bit is that now they're not actually meeting the same expectations that somebody at that salary is currently doing. So now they're actually putting their own position at risk because they can't keep the clients happy because they have to be sold at a certain rate. And again, it's if they're not worth the salary eventually and they keep seeing jumping around, they're going to see that you're just looking for the next opportunity rather than necessarily being invested in the company, right? And again, we're looking much more into investing in the people we have, right? And that have been with us for years, that before they even want to even start looking. Right. So we're definitely taking a slightly different shift to it. And we've sort of just said for some of the more recent ones, if they say, hey, I want to leave, we haven't even battled in terms of, hey, let me offer you the same, let me do, because it's, again, why did you not come to us first? If we're creating a good culture, I'm sure you'll come knocking in a year or so. Right. For the similar type of thing. So we're trying, again, I think it's shifting a little bit back again now. But it was definitely seller's market for the past 2 years. And again, still is a little bit, but you're seeing a bit of a decline now.
So as you're describing that, the thing that I kept jumping into my mind was the fit, right?
Yeah.
Because if I look back early in my career, I moved jobs pretty frequently. And I even had a recruiter one time tell me, hey, you've got great experience. I think I can get you some interviews that would really interest you. But you're going to have to do some explaining because you weren't at some of these companies very long, right? In my case, it actually worked in my favor because the reason I was moving is I was working in high growth companies. And in those companies, people aren't typically staying put for very long because they're expected to take on a lot more and therefore they move a lot more. So you might jump from a staff level job to a manager to a director in maybe 3 years because in that environment, you're exposed to a lot more and you get a lot more under your belt a lot more quickly. On the flip side, if you were a staff accountant or you were working in accounts payable and you're doing the same role at a different company for a year, a couple of years, that's a whole different message that's being sent. That doesn't seem like there's a fit. Maybe something else is going on there where it's not necessarily expected that you would be moving quickly. I'm curious with, obviously there are lots of different ways that people look at getting the right people in the right seats. Does your firm, or do you encourage firms that you work with to use assessments to help in that process of either selecting people or getting the right people in the right seats?
Yeah, so we personally go through quite an extensive interview process. Like we have I believe it's a 3-tier interview process, including testing. So we test them to make sure what they're saying in the interview, they actually can back it up with some results in that sense. Because again, we're looking at all levels, like we're looking at high net worth tax executives as well. So again, you can know the forms and it sounds like you know what you're talking about, but unless you've done it, you won't be able to do it. Right. So it's there's going to be too big of a gap. So we do testing as well. We encourage the firms that we work with to look at those candidates as well. Sometimes we do interviews for more high-level candidates. When it comes to junior, mid-level candidates, we don't do as many interviews because they sometimes can't clearly communicate what they can do, right, in that sense. But we like to showcase exactly and have more of a senior explain exactly what they can and exactly what they can't do, right? Because otherwise they'll say they've got experience with all these forms and in the tax realm, for example, but they may have only done them 10 or 15 of them, right? That's not real true experience there. So we try and balance it with knowing exactly what they can do and making sure that the firms we work with, the companies we work with, they know exactly what they're getting and what they can give so that there's no mismatch of expectation, right? Is that really the key thing? Because like you said, it's partly the expectation setting, but then it's also that reporting. And that's where we try train in terms of make sure we have the reports in place to showcase that, again, this is the budget for a project. This is where, when you want it back, deadlines, let's have it clearly outlined so that it's not just here's a project, get it back to me when you can, no type of framework around it. Because that's when you see like more time will be spent than expected and turnaround time will be slower or quicker. And again, it's very much a fine balance we need to be on the same page for.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're doing assessments in terms of technical skills. Do you use any assessments that try to get at more like personality characteristics like DISC profiles or Hexaco, or any of those that will give you an idea of like how people communicate or work with other people?
Yeah, so we do the DISC assessments, but when they're on board. So not so much when they are in like an interview process, but when they're on board, we do a DISC assessment. And again, that's company-wide.
So more to get the right people in the right seats, more so than to screen people.
Correct.
So to filter people. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So we tend to have, I would say, pretty good judgment, I would say, as a whole, like our recruitment team and because we go through 2 or 3 different people interviewing them, where we can sort of get an idea for the characteristics and who they are and again, what type of personality they are. However, when they actually come on board, we want to, we don't want to risk giving them too much before they actually come on board as well, even though we want them to be invested. It's a risk of losing some candidates as well in that framework too. So we try and balance it a little bit, but it's a good way of doing it when they're on board, because then fitting them around the right managers, for example, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I've heard some interviews with, so I listen to a lot of like business focused podcasts, and there's one I was listening to where they were asking about the hiring process that this one entrepreneur used. They've got like $100 million annual revenue business. And so a big part of what they do is helping other businesses scale. And they were talking about how in their interviews, they would ask them things like they would give them a real problem that they had in their business that was in the wheelhouse of whoever was going to fill that seat that they were looking to fill. And then they would ask them, how would you help us solve that problem if you had this role? And he said what they found is invariably they would have people that would say things like, well, you're going to have to hire me to find out, right?
Yeah.
And he said he knew immediately that if they gave that type of answer, that was not the right fit for his company. And it was just a culture thing. And he even said, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, that's how we approached it. But the way we operate, we operate with radical candor. We have make a big deal about transparency. And we want people that are just going to give everything they have all the time. And if your default mindset is, well, wait a minute, what am I getting first? Immediately, he just saw that as more like a culture mismatch.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you're talking on the employer side, like on the company side, what are some of the things that you're seeing people that let's step aside from the technical skills for a moment and think about more the intangibles. What are some of the things that you see consistently companies are looking for outside of the technical skills?
Yeah, so it's that creative thinking is a big piece that, again, in finance professionals in general, you don't find it as much, I would say. But that's where it's, again, they're the ones that then keep moving up the ladders, and you see it very much in CFOs because again, at the end of the day, it's not clear cut, right? You're able to make decisions based on the specific business you're working for, and you need to understand every area and why they're doing certain things and why they're spending certain amounts and why they're asking for certain budgets, right? So that sort of more creative and open-minded thinking is very important. And somebody that's a bit more, again, open-minded to listening, right? So it's not about necessarily saying this is what it is. It's empowering people to make a decision as to, okay, this is what you want to do. This is the budget you're asking for. Now explain, right? So that there's a good understanding as to why and what type of return on revenue are we going to get, for example. So, because obviously that's a big area, right? At the end of the day, as a finance professional, you're looking at ROIs a lot, right? When it comes to the business, but there's different things when it comes to branding, things that you're not going to necessarily see an immediate ROI to it, but there needs to be some type of traction to that. There still needs to be branding done from a business perspective. So it's that creative mindset, I would say, that is a big area that those types of finance professionals will move up a lot quicker than necessarily somebody that's just an analytical thinker.
Yeah, you touched on something that I think I just by happenstance in some of the jobs that I had was fortunate to work in environments where they gave me a lot of exposure to the operation side of the business. And I think that helped me at an early stage in my career be able to think more strategically because I saw more of the business outside of the numbers, right? And so when it came to creative thinking or problem solving, I had a lot different context of the business because I had seen sort of the inner workings of different parts of the business. Like when I worked at Royal Caribbean, for example, and they would, maybe the reservations department, I supported them with financial analysis every month. I remember one year they put in a big capital appropriations request for some software, multi-million-dollar software, right? And part of my job was to crunch the numbers. What's the ROI and the payback and the IRR and all that good stuff. But part of what was valuable in getting out there and seeing the business is actually having the vice president of that department sit me down to watch their reservation agents do their job and having them point out, okay, as you're watching this person, I want you to pay attention to how long it takes them to do XYZ processes, right? And then I'd watch for a little while. And then they would point out to me the reason that we're looking to make this investment is the software that we're going to get is going to cut that time in half. And that time they're spending is with a customer that's spending money with us, right? So the better they can serve that person with that call, the quicker they can serve them, the more we can upsell them, cross-sell them, all these different things that do drop to the bottom line. But if you don't take the time to understand how things operate, you wouldn't even ask the questions to get the right information to crunch those numbers. So you mentioned listening, and I just kind of mentioned it in the process of that. I'm curious, in my opinion, listening is one of the most critical communication skills and one that is very, very difficult to get good at. I'm curious, in your experience, are there any people in your career who have stood out to you as really, really good listeners?
Yeah, so again, the owner of the company specifically, Chris Robinson. So he's now the executive chairman, but he's very good at listening to everyone and being present and listening to team members, even as they were growing from, again, they got started back in 2004 with a team of 5, right? So, and I believe 4 out of the 5 are still there, right? So, and he's empowered them to keep growing with the company. So it's, again, he has definitely been a big impact on me in terms of listening to the different areas, because at the end of the day, there's different thoughts and mindsets to why you're doing something, right? So the sales team has one mindset, the marketing team has another, and they all have the same objective at the end of the day, is to keep growing the business. So there's a common goal there, but it's, again, they all have their own thoughts, right? So it's balancing everything there. Same thing with the operation. I got very involved in the operation to understand what was going on, because the more I know about it, the more I can understand what types of pushbacks they have sometimes with the clients, and vice versa. Now I can set the expectations accordingly with the clients and the firms that they're doing. And the same thing in terms of that end, I try to understand the firms as well as possible, just because, again, I want to understand what their need is, what their expectations are, but what technology they're using, so that, okay, are they actually implementing new technology? Are they not? Are there other areas where, again, it's not necessarily where we're going to benefit directly from it from a business perspective, but if we can make them more automated, it makes everybody's life easier. They're still going to use us for the same things, but we can now implement technology that they're not using that other firms are using, for example, right? So we try and give that, and again, we try and understand who we're working with first, and we can't just suggest it. If we just suggest it at the beginning, they're less likely to make such a big change before we really understand how they're doing it. Maybe doing it the way they're doing it for a big reason, right? And I've seen certain firms that are specialized in certain industries and niches that they use less technology, but it's because they do every piece of the transaction from end to end, including the advisory, including and it's they then will have a challenge persuading the end client to actually change their technology because they're using a lot of their systems, right? So it's figuring that whole process out. It's not black and white, unfortunately, a lot of the times, without sitting down and, like you said, sitting, watching, observing what's going on, actually asking the right questions. And then you just piece by piece, you're able to, again, suggest things, and you've gained some relationship and respect there as well, where they'll take that now, rather than just necessarily saying, I'm the end all be all, I know this because I've worked with other firms. Other firms isn't the firm you're working with currently, right? And that's what their response typically is going to be for any business. It's, yes, that business is doing this and they're similar, but we're different in this way, right? And that's always going to be the case.
Yeah, you touched on in listening, one of the biggest areas where listening is valuable, or sometimes we're not even aware, is that finding our blind spots, right? Those things that I don't know, right? And there's a question. I went to a training last year, and a guy that was sitting across from me asked me a question I'd never heard before that it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And the question is, what do you know that I don't know, that I wouldn't know if I didn't ask you? And when he said that, it kind of made me like, wait a minute, hold on. Say that again. First of all, it was a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And then I was like, I've never heard anyone ask me that. And I really had to think about it to answer the question. And it gets at the blind spot thing, right? You could send me your bio and I could research you online and look at your LinkedIn profile. But one of the best questions I've ever heard asked is that question, or some version of that question. Another version of it that I like as well is, what is something that I haven't asked you that I should have? Right? Where maybe that person sitting in the seat's going, there's something that's really important that you don't know and you haven't asked me. Right. And sometimes people feel a little hesitant to just volunteer something because they don't want to sound self-serving or like they're bragging or something like that. So I asked you about who you thought was a really good listener. You mentioned Chris Robinson. I'm curious, what are some of the things that to you spoke of him being a good listener? What are some of the things that you saw, heard, and felt that made you go think and feel, this is a good listener? What did that look like?
So it's well, I'd say again, I've been with the company for a lot of boards, executive meetings throughout years, and not just less on monthly meetings, but then when we do different trips, he's not the one. He's the one that has to some extent, and he's the conversation and what we're discussing. But he's not sat there making a comment on every single aspect of it. He's sat listening to everybody give their own views. Into the last
Your audio is cutting in and out.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, it sounded okay just then.
Okay, is this any better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Could you backtrack just a little bit? Because I caught part of it, but I want to get all of that.
Yeah, so the big thing is, like, between all the meetings that I've been in, and again, from board meetings to executive meetings throughout the years, like, again, for the past decade, he's the one to open up the conversation. He's the one that sort of lightens up the atmosphere in the room. And then towards the end of the meeting, he's the one that's closing out a lot of the pieces, and again, giving more of a motivational piece to it, right? And obviously encouraging everybody to say, okay, these are the action points we've put in place to go for it. But he's not the one that's going to interrupt everyone that's when they're presenting or when they're giving in these ideas, he's sort of the last one to speak. He wants to hear the other ideas in the room before he gives a piece that is necessary. If there isn't something necessary to give, he's not going to necessarily say anything, right? And it's that patience sort of to necessarily, like, you may have these areas and ideas that you want to speak up on, or you may have your direction that you want to go in, but sometimes it's better not saying them if you've got the other leaders in the room actually driving it, to let them have that piece to it, right? And be a more setback atmosphere, and just there as okay, no, there's something that I've heard there that's a bit alarming, or there's this one piece that could be a small addition to that, but really encouraging the leadership to really make their own decisions in that sense, right? With just a small bit of guidance throughout. But also from that to necessarily, like, when they're doing a lot of office visits, and again, we have about 10 locations in India now. So going to those, even recently, going to those different locations, and not just with the executive teams, but with every team member, right? Having the town halls where, yes, there's an agenda, but again, there's a clear area for give us feedback, give us your questions, let us hear what's going on with you guys. Like, is there anything that you guys can tell us or that we need to improve? And it's that creating areas for everybody in the company to have that point of view and discussion point, and access is, I think, was very important for, especially a company like we're close to 3,000 employees now. So it's for that magnitude of team members to be able to have a platform to speak to everybody at every level, I think is pretty important, and again, pretty empowering to whether it's somebody just coming on board to one of the executives.
Yeah, so a few things that you said, that creating space is one of the things that I took from that. Creating space for people to feel like they, they've got that voice. You mentioned he always seems like he's the last one to speak, and it reminds me. Do you watch that TV show, The Shark Tank?
Yeah.
One of my favorite TV shows. I talk about it a lot in my training for various different reasons, but Mark Cuban is notorious for being one of the last to speak on a lot of these pitches, right? And sometimes you'll even hear people saying, well, wait a minute, Mark hasn't said anything. And many times he'll just say, I'm just listening, right? And he's probably, in most cases, the biggest shark, the wealthiest of the ones on the panel most of the time. And he probably could have the most to say in terms of experience and knowledge and wisdom and all that. But he's in that mode of just taking things in, analyzing and that type of thing. It also reminded me of Simon Sinek talked about in one of his presentations, the idea that he learned from some military leaders he was working with, which is leaders eat last. And it's that idea that they see as part of their role as a leader, that they're kind of keeping an eye on everything to make sure that everybody else is taken care of first, right? Leading is not about patting yourself on the back and pointing to the stripes on your shoulder that, I'm the boss, I'm above you in rank. It's none of that stuff that some people think it might be, even in situations like the military, where people tend to think, well, you have to listen because, they've got that rank on you. It's no different than in a corporate setting, right? You might be the CEO, but if you're not showing that leadership, you're going to quickly, like what you were talking about earlier, you're going to see that turnover because they don't follow the title, right? They follow the person.
And it's big on passing on the credit, right? At the end of the day, and but you take the responsibility, right? That's in my eyes sort of a good leader, is you're always passing on the credit where it's due, right? At the end of the day, whether you've come up with the idea or you're the one driving it, it's, again, your team members are the ones doing it generally. So you pass on the credit to them, but then at the end of the day, you are going to be held responsible, and you should take responsibility not over individuals' actions, right? It's over the team's actions. So, and the result of what that comes to. So that's sort of a big piece in there.
Yeah. And just kind of the overarching idea of leadership that we've kind of touched on throughout this. One of the ways I've heard people describe leadership is you're leading people to a decision that's good for them, right? So I'm kind of curious. I do a lot of reading on decision making, and I found there's a lot of contrarian content out there from some of the academics on decision making. And I'm curious, when you're making decisions in your business or your personal life, doesn't really matter, how do you if you were just thinking about how you define what a good decision looks like, what does that look like for you? How do you define a good decision?
It's a good question. So again, it's going to be based on, I guess what the question, what the results are going to be. Again, I would say I'm somewhat of an overthinker to some extent. I enjoy problem solving. I will think about what are the results going to be from. Again, it could be a good result, could be a bad result. We don't know until we've taken the action. At the end of the day, I try not to the term analysis paralysis in that sense. I try not to overanalyze necessarily so that nothing gets done. I'm very big on let's put a nice plan together. Let's talk about it as well with anybody that's included in there. So because again, I may have one idea that may not think about everybody necessarily in there. So I want to make sure if it's going to affect multiple people, let's have a decision with those people it affects. Whether it's a family side of it, it would be myself and my wife. Again, even parents sometimes as well. I very often go to my dad just for some feedback and more on the personal side, even business side as well. Because again, he's gone a long way on his career side of things. So and then same thing. I also go to friends of the family as well that I know have done a very good job in business when it comes to business decisions. Other than that, also managers I'm working with, team members I'm working with, I'm very big on just asking them because generally they're the ones that will be doing a lot of the things when it comes to the business side. I don't want to make a decision that I'm not thinking about every aspect that's gone into it from the workload perspective. Can they do it? Right? Where does it need to go? So that I have at least as good of an educated decision as I can have. That's sort of my big thing. As long as I've got that together, I'm fine taking the responsibility personally of that decision and what the outcome is.
Right. Yeah, you reminded me of so there are a lot of the content that I read are from people with military experience who are now working in the business world. And one of the lessons that I seem to see consistency with these people that were in leadership positions is that the people that they saw in leadership positions that they thought were the best leaders would consistently look at the people with the relevant experience to get advice from. And they didn't care what their rank was, right? It didn't matter where they were in the organization on the org chart. They were looking more at life experience and experience in those specific situations where they could tap that experience and not get hung up on the fact that, well, I'm here on the org chart and you're there on the org chart. So therefore, I'm just going to make the decision because I'm the boss, right? And a lot of times there's a lot of humility involved. Sometimes I think in getting that input and that feedback.
And I think that's a big thing, right? When it comes to the, especially in the outsourcing and the accounting and finance space, like it's at the end of the day, I'm not doing it. And even the vice president of operations, even our CEOs, they're not doing that day to day with the clients. A lot of the things we're doing and the changes we make affects a specific client of ours. So typically I will go to the person, the team member that's working on that client, the manager that's working on it. Let's have a discussion around what's going on, what we need to change, why we need to change it. You guys tell me what you can do and make sure they're bought into that as well.
Right.
And then we sort of go back to the client and we say, here, this is why we're doing it. This is what we think we can do. Because again, like you said, we can always say that this is how we should do it. But it's, if the people that we're asking to do it can't do that in that way or aren't bought into that, it's not going to be an effective decision at the end of the day. So it's like you said, it doesn't matter whether they're an FTE that's a junior that just came on board. If they're the ones really doing the day-to-day work that we're making a change for the better, hopefully, I would still want their input on that type of decision.
Yeah, one of the ways I've heard it described, I don't know if you follow, there's a guy named Jocko Willink. He's a retired Navy SEAL and has a consulting company. They typically consult with CEOs and other C-suite executives on leadership. And one of the things he talks about is even when he was in the Navy, in the military, and he was the senior guy, one of the ways that he would get buy-in is he would ask, like he would get passed on to him from his senior, whatever the objective was, right? And instead of going to his men and saying, okay, here's the objective, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do, he would go more with an approach like, here's the objective and the end state that we want. How do you think we should do it? And literally have them sell him on their approach on how they would do it, and then kind of talk them through. And by the end of that whole thing, they basically had sold him on how they were going to do what they were going to do. And when he said, okay, that sounds like a great idea, let's do that. Now they had that ownership and that buy-in, that if they hit a bump in the road, instead of going, well, we better stop and ask the boss what we should do, they'd be like, well, crap, I told them this is how we should do it, so I have to figure this out, right? Because I have ownership of this thing. So it's an interesting, again, we started this whole conversation talking about mindset. It's interesting how a lot of things all go back to that mindset thing. We're about at the top of the hour. I want to respect your time. Give us just in our parting shot here, tell us, remind us again, who are the typical clients that your organization serves? What are some of the main things that you can help them with, problems you can help them solve, and then how do they get in touch with you?
So yeah, predominantly work with CPA firms, accounting firms, anybody really in the finance space. I can also work with finance professionals that have a division that needs accountants, accounts payable, accounts receivable, types of talent, like anybody in the finance space though, really. We provide talent, right, on a virtual basis, predominantly in India, Mexico, and a few other locations as well. So again, it's an outsourced approach, okay? The first sort of step, again, is assessing where you're at currently. You may be using a provider, you may not have even tried it. So it's, again, having a chat, and I'm always open to having sort of a free consultation to understand more about your business, what your needs are, what your requirements are. And again, sometimes it's, you may be working with another firm already, and it's just some improvement points that could help. And you don't have to necessarily move to QX or anybody, but it's about improving the way that outsourcing is seen, is my sort of personal goal. Okay. And again, you can reach me on LinkedIn, or you can reach me. I can pass on my details to John to figure out
we'll put it down in the show notes.
Yeah. So, but again, I can be reached by email, phone, LinkedIn. Really, anyway, is I'm pretty accessible. So a lot of, I would say, my clients will call me whenever they want, and I will pick up the call. I'm quite flexible.
Great. All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Great conversation. And for those of you that have a need in that area, reach out, get that free consultation, because sometimes just having that conversation will open up ideas and maybe potential problems that you might be able to help people solve. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up, and we will see you guys on the next episode.
Perfect. Thanks, John.
All right. Thank you.